So how do I know if my video is bright or dark enough? What's shaking bacon? I'm Joni Simon, food photographer, video creator. Welcome to my studio. This is part 7 in a 9-part series on creating professional videos. So whether you're a food photographer who wants to add video to your list of skills or a content creator looking to take things up a level, this mini course covers all the essential concepts for building your knowledge. This also serves as the introductory unit for my course, Food in Motion, a comprehensive experience for food photographers who want to learn to create captivating videos. I've got more details all about that linked down below. And so how are you doing so far? This is part 7. We have come a long way. We've covered a lot of big concepts, some complicated concepts. So are you hanging in there? Like I said before, feel free to go back and rewatch videos, rewatch lessons. A lot of these things for me took a lot of time to sort of sink in. I had to play with my camera, experiment with things, try things out, get it into my hands and experience it. So feel free to take some time to practice, play around, but I promise we are now officially on the downhill slope of getting started in capturing professional video footage. And so in this lesson, we're going to equip you with the knowledge of accurately setting your exposure. Again, just like the previous lesson, you really need to already have an understanding of how to operate a camera in manual mode and the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO for this lesson to really make sense. And the reason I'm so adamant about using manual mode versus auto mode is simple. It's control and consistency. Let me show you. If I am in auto mode on my camera and things are coming in and out of the frame, or I'm moving the camera, what happens to the exposure? It changes. The camera is automatically increasing and decreasing the exposure based on what it's seeing in the frame. And that creates an inconsistent look and can be super distracting. And so instead, if we're in manual mode, we can keep the same exposure throughout a clip and it looks seamless. It's much more professional. Just see that side by side. And you're gonna hear this time and again in terms of professional video production. Continuity and consistency is key. We wanna minimize unnecessary distractions so that the story and the food can take center stage and capture all of our viewers' attention. So back to exposure. Maybe you've shot videos before, or maybe the previous lesson was your first time putting the camera into video mode. Either way, you might have thought to yourself, how do I know if the video footage is properly exposed? Is that too bright? Is that too dark? Well, there are a number of different ways to solve this problem. For the purposes of this mini course, since in theory you're just getting started, we're gonna start with the simplest method that doesn't require purchasing any additional tools. We're gonna utilize the camera's built-in histogram. Now, maybe you have seen the histogram before, but you're like, I don't know what that means. Well, today is your lucky day. We're gonna get into it. So let's go ahead and practice this together. Go ahead and get out your camera. There should be a setting inside your camera's menu, most likely in one of the display menus or settings that turns on the histogram, specifically the brightness or luminance histogram. And you can see it here on my camera in live view. It's this little box with a graph. If your camera doesn't offer it in live view, pretty much all cameras will have a setting for it to show you when you're reviewing images or videos like you see here when I hit the play button. But go ahead, bust out the manual, get on the Google machine, take a moment to locate the histogram on your camera. Can't find it? Well, I do find the quickest way to find out how to activate the histogram on a given camera is to hop over to the Google machine and type in view histogram and then insert your camera model, like view histogram Canon 6D Mark II. And then right here, there's the instructions on where to activate the brightness histogram on your camera. Now you might also see an RGB histogram, but we're not gonna dive down that rabbit hole for now. We're just gonna focus on the brightness histogram here. And so what are we looking at? Well, this is a graph that is plotting the values in terms of the brightness of all the pixels present in your image. Back to those darn pixels again. You see this line along the bottom over here, the furthest to the left side, that represents black. And for each level of brightness, we assign a number. Black here at the bottom of the scale is represented as 0. And on the furthest right side, that is white, represented at 255 at the top of the scale. And so then every point between black and white is varying shades of gray. From middle gray, which is about halfway between 0 and 255, we'll call that 128. And then dark gray is right around 64 to light gray at 192. And so then imagine your picture was turned into a black and white photo, and each individual pixel in your image you took and you plotted on this graph, lining them up one on top of each other on the number line based on their value. that all the totally black pixels line up on the 0 line, and all of the totally white pixels line up on the 255 line, and all of the grays line up on their corresponding lines. So let's look at the histogram before I show you the corresponding picture. Just purely based on the histogram, what can you tell me about the photo I'm about to show you? Well, for one, there's a lot of pixels bunched up here on that left side. That's the dark gray to black side. If we have a lot of dark gray and black pixels present, what does that mean for our image? Well, probably it's a pretty dark overall image. And funny enough, there are no pixels plotted on the right quarter of the line. Pretty much from light gray up to 255, there are no pixels present. And there's a bit of a gap on that top end. So what does that mean? Well, there really aren't any bright tones present in this image. So based on this information, it's pretty safe to assume that this is going to be a pretty dark image. Let's go ahead and take a look. And yep, we were correct. Just by looking at it, you might already recognize that this image is underexposed. And the histogram confirms that, because even in dark and moody scenes, there will still be at least some bright pixels present, most likely where the light hits the subject. Like in this shot, there are definitely a lot of dark pixels present there on the histogram, but there's still some pixels on the upper end too. And that's what we're aiming for in terms of exposure in our images, a distribution of tones across a whole graph. Now, there is no ideal shape or gold standard of what the histogram should look like, except for it should have pixels present ranging from dark to light. Like here's a really bright image that we know is still properly exposed though, because we see a lot of pixels to the right of center. There are still some on the left side too, representing the shadows. And that helps ensure that our image has a 3D quality, because all images, no matter if they're dark or bright or somewhere in between, should have highlights and shadows. Quantities, of course, will vary, but all the tones to some degree should be there. But now one rule of the histogram that is wise to follow in video work is also to keep within the boundaries of 0 and 255. Because this graph represents the visible spectrum, what we refer to as the dynamic range of what your camera is capturing. Because it's important to know that cameras are different from our eyes. For example, sitting here in my studio, I can see the details in the dark shadows of the room over there, but I can also at the same time see the details of things outside. There's a window right over here, and I can see those things in broad daylight. Our eyes have massive dynamic range, but our cameras have a limited range of light intensities it can capture, from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights, while still maintaining detail. So let me show you what I mean. I set my exposure based on being able to see the details in the shadow areas of the room, but then the window is completely blown out. Through my eyes, I can still totally see what's outside, but you can't. The light in that area has exceeded the dynamic range of my camera, and we cannot see the details in those bright spots. And if we look at the histogram for this scene, you can see that we have dark pixels present, which is good, but look at how the pixels are all bunched up, climbing up the right side of the histogram. Those pixels have essentially gone off the graph. They are too bright. They are out of range, and we call that clipping the highlights. They're clipped because they're gone. They're not able to be recovered. Even if we try to adjust this footage in post, that information is lost and we cannot reclaim those details in those bright areas based on this exposure. And so now let's go ahead and dial in different camera settings and expose for the bright area instead. There's the detail in the bright areas. But now our shadows are super dark, beyond black, and we can't see any details. And we also see that reflected in the histogram, where all the pixels are riding up that left side. We've gone off the chart into the black abyss, and that information, again, can't be reclaimed. We've clipped or crushed the blacks. And so these are the two things that we in general want to keep in mind and avoid when selecting exposure for video. Mind the top and the bottom ends of the histogram and ensure we're preserving as much detail as possible throughout our scene. That said, when it comes to video specifically, in contrast to capturing photos, it's especially important to protect those highlights, because when highlights are overexposed or clipped during video capture, the data in those areas is lost. Once the highlights are blown out, there's no information left to recover. Whereas shadows typically retain a bit more information and detail even when underexposed, so you will still have something to work with in editing. So if you are in a situation where you have to either choose between under or overexposing, I would err on the side of underexposing. That said, while it's generally easier to recover detail and shadows from editing, it's still important to expose your footage properly during filming to minimize the need for extensive adjustments in post. Even if you're shooting in log format, which expands your camera's dynamic range potential, or you plan to color grade your footage in editing, proper exposure ensures that you capture the best possible image quality and retain as much detail as possible, both in the highlights and the shadows. So when I'm filming and using the histogram to dial in my exposure, what does that that look like? Well, you can see here with this scene, I'm at 30 frames per second frame rate, so I'm at 1/60th shutter speed per the 180-degree shutter rule, and an aperture of f6.3 to give me a wide enough depth of field to see my subject. And then I just started ISO 100 as my baseline. I'm also using an LED light for lighting, which we'll touch on more in the final lesson of this mini course. And so if I look at the histogram right now, I can see there's a gap on the top end telling me that I'm underexposed. But I want to leave my shutter speed where it is for the 180-degree shutter rule, and I don't want to go any wider on my aperture because that would mean a more narrow depth of field and less of my subject would be in focus. Now, I also have my light as bright as it can go. It's at 100%. So I'm going to increase the ISO until I can see the pixels in the histogram start to hit the higher end without touching the right side. As soon as they touch the right side, I'm risking clipping. So dial it back just a little bit from there, and that's just right. Now, your camera might have highlight clipping alert or something called zebra stripes that shows you the areas that are in danger of highlight clipping, which is a great tool as well. But familiarity with the histogram is a great visual way to spot check where your exposure is and if it needs to be adjusted. Because here's the cold hard truth is that you cannot always trust, oftentimes you cannot trust what you see on the camera's LCD screen or your external monitors. There have been so many times, especially when I first started out, that I'd filmed something that looked great on the LCD screen, but then when I got it into the computer to edit it, it looked way over or way underexposed. The histogram is so much more accurate than just eyeballing how things look on the camera screen. So 7 lessons down, we've got 2 more to go. The next one, we're going to focus in on helping you select the right video editing software based on the unique needs that you have. It's still important to expose your